First of all, let's start with your selection of poems. I mean, with your formidable knowledge of poetry, it must have been quite a difficult choice in the first place. But first of all, just say something about the Herbert.
First of all, the readings were both excellent, I thought, and what I liked about them was that the readers found the thought of the poems in the syntax and did not impose a kind of emotion on I didn't watch them when they were reading, so maybe they were grimacing and doing things, but the voices were it was appropriate. The reason I think I chose the poems is because they both use a very, very simple language. Neither of them really uses images as such. They use emblems, and I love, in the Herbert in particular, I love the way in which the stanzas, the little rooms, each contain a different kind of, well, obviously a different time point, but also a different kind of syntax, different kind of content and vocabulary. It's a wonderfully discriminated poem, really, really beautiful. And it also has, I dislike the word voice, but the poem has a voice. I read and sigh and wish I were a tree, for sure then I should grow to fruit or shade. Some bird should trust her household. You got one word wrong there. It's household. and I should read that. That's a long time. So I also obviously love Herbert's Anglicanism. To me, it's the kind of Anglicanism that when Charles I, the night before he was executed, was reading the Temple. It seems to be a very good thing to read. It's a kind of meditation.
Yeah, yes, very much so. And the Marianne Moore. It's lovely that you've chosen Marianne because I don't see that not many people refer to Marianne Moore. I really like Marianne Moore, so I was pleased you.
Well, Marianne Moore is one of the most rewarding poets around. I mean, obviously Elizabeth Bishop thought so too, at least in her early years. And I absolutely love the way in which each poem is totally different from the one before and the one after. The way in which she controls time and pacing, you did a really wonderful job. It was that I had never been able to read that poem until I heard a recording of her reading it, and the syntax came clear to me in a way that my reading I didn't perceive it. So again, much as I dislike the notion of voice, the poet's voice actually brought that poem to me. And the line of the bird himself grown taller as he sings, steals. It's very, very beautiful. But it's beautiful without any of the kind of glitter and trappings that we always associate with poetic beauty. It's unpoetic, but it's highest poetry.
I think it was read at Ezra Pound's funeral, wasn't it? I think.
Was it? Oh, that's interesting.
I think so, yeah. Pretty sure it was.
Yeah.
It was I know something that you do. That's something amazing. So let's move on. I thought, first of all, before I get to your work, and so I wanted to sort of ask you more about your own life. So I wanted to take as a sort of guide through your life this remarkable poem, "The Love of Strangers," a book-length poem, which is in the selected poems. I really recommend. I spent a weekend reading. I loved it, and I was struck. There's a section about your father. And one of the lines is, half my life you've been dead, yet not absent for a single day. So I thought it would be good to start, in a way, with talking a bit about your father and perhaps even those lines.
My father was a very straightforward American. He was born in 1892, so he was quite an old father. I'm quite old, but he was quite older. He was born the year that Whitman died and the year that Tennyson died. So he also was one of the first aviators in Mexico. So he was the second person with an airplane in Mexico, and he was the first man to fly from Mexico to Cuba. So he did all sorts of strange things. He introduced the Fuerte avocado into California, which was the basis of the avocado industry, and then the Hass avocado. We've had a lot of avocados here, including... So he's referred to as the father of the avocado in California, which makes me the half-brother of the avocado. Explains the greenish complexion. He was a Teddy Roosevelt American. He saw service in the First World War with the American Army, obviously towards the end. And I have a telegram that he sent to President Eisenhower at the time when peace was made in Korea, saying you don't divide the country or it will come to haunt you. It's very strange. He believed that you could send a telegram to the president, that the president would read the telegram. He was very, very in favor, I think, of almost all of America's external enterprises, including Vietnam. And that was the point at which at which he and I, as it were, parted company, rather, because I was drafted into the American Army and preferred to become British. Well, preferred to become Mexican first and then British, and renounced my citizenship. And that was something he never understood, and possibly never forgave. And we had a huge argument, and at the end of the argument he said, "You intellectual." And I realized that there was nothing he could have said that would be more hurtful than he. And he died soon after. So that's why he's present all the time. I have a continual attempt to befriend him and to make him acknowledge me in a curious way, which I'm sure he does in some. Well, ask him.
And of course you were brought up in Mexico, and there's this wonderful portrait of your nurse, again in The Love of Strangers. You talk about learning Spanish from her, for instance. I thought it'd be interesting to hear about your childhood in Mexico.
Yes.
How did you get there?
Well, I was born there. I got there. The stork brought me, and we lived briefly in California when I was a little boy. But I spent most of my childhood in Mexico, and we were well-to-do, so we had quite a few servants. And Gavina, my nurse, became my nanny, as it were. Couldn't read or write. She was from a little town called San Francisco Coacalco, outside Mexico City. Of course, Mexico City has now swallowed it up along with everything else. And she spoke a wonderful dialect-rich Spanish, which is the Spanish I learned. So I used to write for Octavio Paz's magazine, and he, after a while, he said to me, "Could you possibly write in English? I'll get your pieces translated." He says, "You sin too much against the language." So in Spanish, at least, I have a kind of rustic, rural accent.
How interesting. And your mother? You finished the poem with your mother, don't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, my mother and I had a very close relationship, and we too somehow fell out at the end. She remarried. I think that was her when my father died, and that was probably an unforgivable sin from my point of view. Though I didn't consciously realize that. I was rather relieved when she got remarried. But we were very close. She was a very attentive mother. We had a wonderful house in which a great deal of reading was done. At dinners, we always played games, word games, capital, country, all sorts of wonderful games. We also had records playing all the time during the meal, so that we learned all the songs of the 1920s and 30s. So I have a wonderful repertoire of songs. And I think maybe poetic form comes from song when you're young. And there's some wonderful old college drinking songs, which stay with one.
Of course.
I won't sing them.
And you talk of having a chauffeur, for instance. So, how well? I mean, it sounds like a slightly rude question, but
how rich were you?
How well-to-do were you?
In Mexico at the time, you could buy quite a lot of them with a modicum. Yes, we were well off. We had a large house in the city which was rented, and we had a large house in the country which was owned, and we had chauffeurs and gardeners and that sort of thing. Yes, they were all well loved and well looked after, but they were servants.
And how did you experience being in Mexico growing up?
I loved it. I've never. It is the place where my imagination still lives. The house we had in the country was not in the country. It was in a town called Cuernavaca near Mexico City, about 2 hours drive. And we went there every weekend. It was a town where Under the Volcano was partly written, and obviously Lawrence spent time there as well as in Oaxaca. And so it was a fascinating little town, lots of colonial history, and I very early on developed a passion for pre-Columbian archaeology and art, and so there was quite a lot of that around as well, and that's something that's continued. Though my interest in colonial stuff has become much more accentuated, and we now Mexico looms large again. I see Oaxaca is now my hometown, as it were. And two of the people in the audience have just returned from our house there, and it too is a beautiful colonial city.
And then you ended up going to Harvard. So how did you?
What happened is I got an English-speaking union scholarship to come to England, and I went to a school called Christ's Hospital School in Horsham in Sussex, famous because Coleridge and Lamb went there, and Barnes Wallis, who invented the bouncing bomb. And I really loved it. It was great fun. And so I got into Harvard. But as soon as I got to Harvard, I decided I really wanted to come to Oxford. So I took an exam and was given a scholarship and came back to Oxford. So I dropped out of Harvard.
Why did you want to go to Oxford?
I think it had something to do with libido.
Can you...
Well, there was a schoolmaster at Christ's Hospital of whom I was very fond, and he and I set up Carcanet, and I came back to Oxford partly to be with him, and partly to go to Oxford.
And how did you find, coming to England then? Did that feel a strange culture to you? Did you find, all those famous sort of things about the English and so on?
Well, the first thing I was told at the English-speaking union was when you got in the olden days, most of you won't remember, there were carriages in trains where you had little compartments. Do you remember? The compartment right through the train. And I was told that as soon as you get into a compartment, the first thing you do is you introduce yourself to everyone in the compartment. So, hello, I'm Michael Schmidt. I'm from Mexico, and everybody's sort of folding themselves into their Times or their Telegraphs. I found it really fascinating. I immediately took a tremendous liking to all the eccentricities and oddities of English life. And I didn't develop a political consciousness at the time, so nothing seemed to me to be wrong. It all just seemed to be as it was. I wasn't an ironist at that time.
It's such a beautiful place to be.
Yeah.
And then, again in that poem, The Love of Strange, I was really struck by this moment where you meet Robert Frost. I thought it would be nice to tell us that story.
At my school in Pennsylvania, where I went to private school, where I'm told to my horror that Mr. Trump has sent some of his children. But this is long, I have nothing to do with that. They used to always have visiting speakers, and we had Dean Acheson came, we had a number of famous public figures, but we also had regular poetry visits. We had Richard Eberhardt, we had Robert Penn Warren, no women, and we had Robert Frost. So my first year at the Hill School, Robert Frost came, and I was allowed to show him around the campus. So that was very exciting. And I mentioned in the poem that he recited a poem by Emily Dickinson, and that's when I realized how meter works as a mnemonic, because I never forgot the poem. It was the poem, The Heart Asks Pleasure First, and then Excuse from Pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then To Fall Asleep, and then If It Should Be the Will of the Inquisitor, The Liberty to Die. It was wonderful, and I never actually even had to, well, I have looked it up since, but it was amazing to hear it and have it go into memory.
And can you remember what you made of Frost? You were 14, weren't you?
I was 14. I really love Frost. Frost and Larkin are probably the poets I read most often. And I later on studied, I started doing an whatever they call it at Oxford, and I started studying Edward Thomas and comparing Thomas's prosody with Frost's. And Frost is much more obviously regular. Thomas is much more inventive, not inventive, a much freer prosodist. But I just love the sounds the poems make. And again, his refusal to use images as images. The poems are always they're always alive. They never become literary.
Yeah, that's right. And Pasolini, you say you meet Pasolini. I mean, this is after reading all those. Suddenly discover that you've met, you've had this incredible life. Yeah. You met him at a party in London. Yeah,
there was a Poetry International, and I think many of us met him. Yes, he came along and read from his novels and read from his poems as well. Yes, he read, and we later on published his essays and two of his novels. The person, I will tell you, because Pasolini is gay, I will tell you a story about another gay writer that we published called Aldo Busi. Aldo Busi wrote a book called The Seminar on Youth, and he came to England and was immediately arrested for propositioning a policeman in Oxford Circus toilet. And he decided he would come back to England and demonstrate that the law was as repressive as it had been in Oscar Wilde's time. So he came back, and he asked me to be his character witness. And the day before the trial, he gave an interview to, I think it was Gay Times or something, saying, in my life I've had 12,400 partners. Now, my accountant and I were working on how many this was. In any event, he got to the court, and his solicitor did some plea bargaining. So the judge, who was obviously of a similar persuasion, said, "Well, Mr. Boozy, I would like to give you an unconditional discharge, but I'll have to bind you over to keep the peace." And suddenly the language of the law had become richly sexualized.
So moving along fairly smartly, I thought it'd be just obviously an obvious question is how you founded Carcanet in 1969, and then PM Review, which was originally Poetry Nation, in 1972. How did that happen? How did you end up doing all that?
When I was at Harvard, I desperately wanted to be on the Harvard Advocate. And they wouldn't let me on. I wasn't voted on. And so I set up a little magazine called The Island with two other poets, John Plotz and Robert B. Shaw. And that lived about 3 issues. And then I came to Oxford, and the very first meeting I went to the Poetry Society, there was a man called Roger Garfitt, who later became one of my poets, who was the president of the Poetry Society, and he said, "Does anyone want to take over this magazine called Carcanet," which was an Oxford-Cambridge literary liaison magazine? And of course, instantly it was as though my wish had been granted. And I took it on. And unfortunately, it came only with debts. It had about 40 or 50 pounds worth of debts, which at that time was a lot of money. Anyway, so I started running it, Carcanet, as a magazine. And then we did a few pamphlets, which were tremendously well reviewed in The Guardian, the TLS, and so on, and the Times. And so we thought, wow, this is fun. And so we started doing some more. And then after that, we couldn't stop. But it was called Carcanet after the magazine. A horrible name. Let me tell you, if you ever are going to set up a company, be sure you choose the right name. Because nobody can pronounce it. And it has the word arcane nestled between the C and the T.
And PN Review?
So I needed a magazine. I as an editor, I like to read my way into poets, and a magazine is the most wonderful, as it were, trawling tool, if you like. And so I set up. It started off as Poetry Nation twice yearly, and then I realized, well, you don't catch many fish if you only go out twice a year. So it became quarterly, and then it became bi-monthly.
And when we were talking earlier, you were saying that's one of your great pleasures, PM Review.
It still is, though I do make an awful lot of mistakes. But and I don't mean editorial mistakes, not like Stephanie Burt and his colleague at The Nation. I hope you've all been following that interesting story about. Have you? They published a poem which they then, as it were, withdrew the whip from. They apologized to the world for having published this poem. Very strange. The errors are to do with misprints and so on.
But why is it so important to you, do you think?
I like critical discourse very much.
Yeah.
I like stories. I like humor, and I love good new poetry. So I think that's why it's important.
Yeah, of course.
You keep discovering people. Yeah.
And touching on poetry again for you for the moment. There's again in The Love of Strangers, you talk about this meeting with Robert Fitzgerald and taking him 40 poems, of which you only liked the first one. Was that your discovery of your own writing? When did poetry? Was that the moment that poetry entered your life in terms of writing it?
Oh no, I started writing when I was about 6. I wrote a book of sonnets for my grandmother. All the red letter days in the calendar. Unfortunately, I don't have it. So, no, I always wrote poetry. I just did from the very beginning, all through school.
Do you know
but
why?
I wrote too much. Why? No. No. It's like scratching, isn't it? Yes, I can't think why. No, I think I just love language, and I think also being bilingual. The transactions between Spanish and English are very interesting. The total difference, the polysyllabic values of the one and the largely monosyllabic values of the other, the different tonalities, the fact that if you dream in one language, you dream very differently than from the way you dream in the other language. Also, my Spanish was coarse and rural, whereas my English was raffiné. So.
And I wanted to then just turn to Lives of the Poets, which, as I say, I've been really, really enjoying it. One of the things that struck me about Lives of the Poets is how even-handed it is. You reevaluate Stevie Smith. You're quite critical of Owen. a wonderful essay on Milton. I was thinking if someone was sending poems to PN Review, if they'd read through that, which of course they will have done, if they read through that, they'd be hard pushed to know what poems you'd like, because in this you talk very positively of Pound's cantos, and then you talk very positively of someone like Frost or Houseman. You talk very well of him. Can you say something about your sort of you're very unideological, it seemed to me, as a critic, very even-handed, very very difficult to pin down quite what your approach to poetry is.
Well, I think one doesn't have an approach. I think one has a lot of approaches. I think if you're reading Pound and the modernists, you read in one way, and it fulfills one set of needs that you might have as a reader or as a writer. And if you're reading Frost or Edward Thomas or Larkin, then you have another set of expectations. There are lots of poets, including Edward Thomas and Rosenberg and so on, who bridge the two. And neither camp is entirely closed. I mean, there are a lot of wonderful poems by Pound, which I'm sure Larkin would have liked, especially some of the Chinese translations and so on. So I don't think either camp is sealed off. There's more sealing off possibly in the latter years. I mean, in our time, with orthodoxies of hostility and advocacy, which I think are impoverishing, and I think theorized reading can be very impoverishing as well. Yeah. I mean, if I'm troubled, obviously, deeply troubled by Pound's politics, but it would not stop me reading him.
Yes, of course. Of course. I mean, what struck me reading it, reading again and again, is that if I was to say what sort of touched you most, would be a sort of poetic integrity.
Yes.
That it seemed that the language, that the creation, that the poem, sort of was an integral shaping of the poet. It doesn't need to be about the poet or about their life, but that would be the only thing I would think of as being a kind of underlying thing for you. I don't know whether that.
I think what ultimately matters is the poem, and not very good poets can write extraordinarily good poems. But I think it's the poem that matters, and I think the personalization. I mean, it's called Lives of the Poets, isn't it? And there's quite a lot about the lives, but only the bits that actually relate to the poems, the weirdnesses that turn the poet into the poet that she is. There aren't enough women in that book, by the way.
Interesting.
But there are a few of them. A few of the people in this room are.
Yeah, you mentioned me. What was that? Yes, the other thing that's striking about Lives is that there's moments of your own biography in it, like your father's concern about you becoming a publisher, for instance. There's a moment where we sort of watching Ginsberg read. I thought you might say something about those moments there.
Well, I think we all have a kind of readerly life when we encounter living poets and dead poets. So there are moments when you probably remember the moment. Stendhal remembers the moment when he first read Don Quixote, which is rather nice. He was a boy sitting under a tree along a driveway, and I think seeing Ginsberg read was something that stayed with me for a long time. As for my father's attitude, it was this kind of, I don't know why I mentioned it, but I suppose I was still trying to justify myself to him in some way or other. By then he was dead.
I mean, it's interesting as well, because one of the things that I was thinking, reading through, is what motivates you, because in some ways, I'll come into your poems in a minute, but in some ways, you're a literary critic and poet as rigorous as, I don't know, Donald Davy or Ivor Winter, that you talk very well about. And yet you also seem to me as a kind of adventurer. I don't know whether that's fair, a kind of psychonaut.
I think the thing with Donald Davy and Winters is they spent their whole lives teaching and reading, and they are infinitely more learned and understand much more, especially about prosody and literary history, than I ever could or would actually want to, because I think in a way there were certain places they got mired down, especially Winters. So I would not in any way compare myself to them. I feel my book is much lighter than their books, though Donald writes wonderfully accessible prose and very, very punchy prose as well.
But there's that same sort of looking into poetry very deeply, from my point of view, and writing it.
I see what you mean. Yeah,
You sort of mean.
Yeah.
Do you think what motivates that dual thing?
Well, I think if you read a lot, if you read a lot and you're asked to write about things. I mean, very early on, I was asked to write a book about poetry, so I did 50 poets from Gower to Hopkins, and another book called 50 Poets from Hardy to Hill. I wrote those when I was in my 30s, early 30s. You get into the habit of writing about. Also, when you write about, you actually come to understand sometimes, and misunderstand sometimes too. I have a feeling I didn't answer that question.
That's right. So, trying to think, where I'm going to take you next. I mean, the other thing that struck me is in Lives is your sympathy for religious poetry, which I don't know why it surprised me, but it did sort of slightly surprise me. Especially, you speak so well about Pound, and then you speak just as well about Jennings, Elizabeth Jennings, for instance, and you seem to have a quite strong feeling for the value of religious, spiritual, whatever word you want to use. And then, of course, I see that in your own work, that there's a quite strong spiritual feeling in, particularly some of the poems that, in the selected.
Yes, it's an interesting issue. The reason I wrote very respectfully about Elizabeth Jennings is that she was a dear friend and she was still alive and extremely highly strung, so you couldn't say anything negative about her. So there are certain real issues that colour all one's writing. I think that I'm fascinated by the idea of the incarnation and the notion of a transcendence entering the world, and I think that the language of the Anglican liturgy, the old language of the Anglican liturgy, is imbued with a tremendously strong ability to embody. So, again, it's the example I always fish out, which is the marriage service. Instead of saying, "I give you this ring as a symbol of our marriage," you say, "With this ring I thee wed." And the word order, everything else is inactive. And the great religious poets, Herbert in particular, Donne to some extent, and obviously Marvell, and Milton too, in his rather horrible, different way, are wonderful inactive poets, and there's this wonderful sense in which their poems are connecting a transcendence with a material reality that we inhabit. The notion of the resurrection of the body, which totally obsessed me for about 10 years, it's such a fascinating idea. Or fact, depending on how you look at it.
Depending on how you look at it. What else was I going to say? Yes, the other thing that struck me from the Lives is, well, one of the points that you talk about, there's a wonderful discussion about T.E. Hume and imagism and Pound's dogmatism. And you say some outstanding creative forces of our century have lost the wide perspective that earlier poets possessed and took for granted. And I wondered whether you were trying to respond to that loss in the Lives, that you were trying to open that perspective again, because you seem to want to speak for what have become quite opposing camps.
I think that's exactly what I would like to do. Would like to have done with that book, because yes, there is a sense in which whole shoals of poets refuse to read Larkin because of his politics, B, because of his form, C, because of his attitudes to sex and so on. And it is so impoverishing because there's so much there that and you don't have to. It doesn't mean approval when you approve of some of the poems or elements in the poems. And I do think Edward Thomas, when he reviewed a volume of Pound, he said, "Mr. Pound writes as though Shakespeare had not written in English." He was saying this as he had reinvented the language, as it were. And I think Lascelles Abercrombie or Gordon Bottomley or something, his editor said, "You must not say that again. You must." So the second review that he wrote of Pound was, in a sense, an attack on him. But he was responding to the newness of Pound, just as Pound was responding to a lot of the older things that were around him. And Eliot too, obviously. Eliot's list at Faber is full of so many people who would seem to be hostile to his own aesthetic, but of course are extending it in different ways.
And then talking about Eliot, you mentioned how Eliot going so deeply into publishing you distracted him from his own work, or limited it, meant that he didn't give it so much time to his own new work. So, one couldn't help wondering whether that was true of you. You've given so much of your life to criticism and publishing. Has that diverted you from to some extent from your own writing?
I was reading through my poems for today. I was surprised that I don't think so. I was thinking that the poems that are there are the poems that I wrote, and I mean one or two more poems may sneak up on me, but I don't feel that. I mean, I feel I wouldn't have written the poems that I did write, or that I do write, without having published and read what I've published and read. Read and published, let's put it that way.
And then, just sort of drawing us to a close, but you're in many ways, and you might not like this sort of way of forming it, but your life has been in many ways a literary life, right from the beginning, and the amount of thought you've given to the novel, we haven't even touched on a biography of the novel, which is a whole other, there's just too much to talk about, but your life has been a very literary life. You've thought about poetry a lot, you've published a lot, you've read masses of work, ancient and modern. Why is it so important to you?
To me, poetry is probably the highest literary art, and it seems to me a little bit endangered. And it's very important to me that the best from the past and the best that's coming out now should be recognized and published. And I don't trust the judges of the day. I'm at Newcastle. There was a big gathering of publishers and so on, and we were all attacked for being gatekeepers. Not only gatekeepers, but white, middle-aged, male gatekeepers. And I said, I built the fucking gate, and 50 years on, I never made a fortune out of it. I've made my fortune out of teaching. So it's something that I feel is urgently important for reasons that I suppose can't be made materially manifest. I don't know. It seems it's a bit like keeping the faith alive in some way or other. Keeping the faith that I think is the faith alive. The notions of embodiment, notions of a language which is fully expressive and which isn't compromised by audience and isn't compromised by isn't compromised. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I mean, in the lines you talk about saying there's two kinds of poetry. One is sort of, as it were, political and about community, and another is about personal, as it were, personal, although much bigger than that, about communal, about the what do you do? the communion. That's right.
Communion. Yeah.
Yeah. And is it something about that's so important to you for poetry, that it's somehow is that the wager of poetry is to speak from the individual to everyone? No,
to anyone, not to everyone. Again, I think the notion, the Arts Council keeps saying its mantra is great art for everyone. Well, no. As soon as you say that everyone has to have great art, either you force it down their throats or you water it down and compromise it. And I think, but I think if you have, Milton was right. Fit audience find the few, and the audience for the kind of poetry that I have given myself over to is always going to be a limited audience. It requires patience. It requires love, I guess. It requires all sorts of qualities which and it probably doesn't relish the mobile phone and that kind of culture as much as it we'll probably have to learn to do with now that we have poems coming from mobile phones. I saw my first reading from a mobile phone the other day in Cambridge. Somebody read their poems off my. It's a curious thing to do. I can't see my phone well enough to.
and just to finish, perhaps these are the two grand questions I know, and perhaps and not very attractive to you. But what is poetry for?
For?
Yeah.
Nothing at all. No, I, as soon as it becomes, I mean, poetry can be used in different causes. I mean, you know, McDiarmid trying to forge a new Scotland or whatever. But no, I think it can have a utility in its period, but if it's going to live on, it usually transcends its utility. You can read Herbert without being an Anglican. You know, you can read Donne without being a heterosexual. You know, and without being an Anglican too. No, I can't. I would hate to say there was a purpose to it.
And that's its value, is it?
Yes, its value is that it can't be the good poetry can't be, as it were, taken over. Maybe. There's a grand statement to end on.
So let's finish there. Thank you very much, Michael.